right, so welcome to Study Hall, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of Cold War intelligence.
Yeah.
And, when we think of Cold War intelligence, we often think about, the Soviets and what they were doing. But we have this really fascinating collection of declassified documents that you've brought.
Absolutely.
That delve into how the U.S. was looking at not just the Soviets, but also countries that they considered friendly at the time.
Yeah.
It's a huge collection of stuff, FBI memoranda, intelligence reports, and even some budget information.
Yeah. And when you start looking through this material, what really strikes you is just how broad their concerns were.
Yeah.
During this period, we tend to think of the Cold War as this very kind of black and white, binary kind of confrontation. But when you look at these documents, it was a lot more nuanced than that. Yeah. They really wanted to understand what a whole range of countries were up to and what their capabilities were. I mean, it was much more complicated than just than just the Soviets, right?
Yeah. So let's jump into this. And, I think to start off, it's no surprise that their initial focus and probably their most intense focus at the time was on the Soviet bloc, right? I mean,
absolutely.
That's kind of,
no question,
what we think of with the Cold War, right?
Yeah. And, I think it's important to remember the context here. These satellite states, these countries like Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, they weren't just operating on their own. Their intelligence activities were, to a large degree, coordinated and directed by Moscow.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at their embassies, their UN missions, these were really seen as outposts of Soviet intelligence.
Yeah. Right. And one of the documents even says, point blank, these were key locations for their espionage activities.
Yeah.
And by, February of 1969, we're talking about a significant number of personnel from these satellite countries who were identified as having intelligence assignments in the U.S., something like 117. And that's a huge increase.
It's a staggering number, isn't it? I mean, you're talking about almost, double the number of personnel in just, a decade.
Right.
So it really gives you a sense of, the scale of the challenge that the U.S. was facing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when you have this intense focus on the Soviet bloc, I think it's natural to wonder how intelligence agencies were even able to think about broadening their scope.
Yeah, how did they even start to look beyond the Soviets, right?
Right, and that's what I think is so interesting about these documents.
Yeah.
Is they reveal this kind of evolution and the approach.
Yeah.
And, the FBI really recognizes, that threats and valuable intelligence can really come from anywhere, even from countries that they consider friendly.
Absolutely.
And so they initiate this 3-phase program.
Right.
And what I thought was really interesting is that it's not like, this is some kind of, backroom, shadowy, operation.
Right, exactly.
It required significant coordination with the State Department. They were walking this very delicate, diplomatics.
Yeah, they couldn't just operate, in a vacuum.
Right.
They had to be very careful about, the potential international repercussions of their actions.
Yeah, and I think that need for State Department approval is, a really crucial insight.
Absolutely.
Even at the height of the Cold War, domestic intelligence gathering couldn't just operate without, thinking about, what was going on internationally.
Yeah, and it really highlights the role of the State Department as this kind of vital check, making sure that this was a calculated approach, to intelligence gathering and not just, kind of an unfettered pursuit of information that could, damage relationships.
So let's break down this 3-phase program, because it really shows how methodical they were in their approach. Phase 1, kicking off in November of 1954, was all about monitoring the arrival of foreign intelligence personnel. And the documents indicate that 6 other U.S. intelligence agencies, and they don't name them, but, you can imagine, we're talking about, the CIA, NSA groups like that, were tasked with notifying the FBI about people coming into the country from countries outside of the Soviet bloc with known or suspected intelligence backgrounds.
Right. So they were really trying to close what they called an intelligence gap,
Yeah.
Even with countries that they had friendly diplomatic ties with, they still wanted to know who was operating, in the U.S. And what they might be up to.
Exactly. And these notifications would include, the person's identity and, importantly, whether they had any known affiliation with other U.S. agencies. And that really allowed the FBI to create this sort of registry, of foreign operatives for, future scrutiny.
Yeah. And, it's interesting to think about the different agencies involved here, right? Because the type of intelligence that they were gathering varied quite a bit.
Right.
The NSA, for example, they're primarily focused on signals intelligence, right? Intercepting communications, analyzing that kind of stuff.
Right.
And while that's, incredibly valuable for understanding kind of broader foreign activities, it might not always have that, direct application to the FBI's work, which was often, focused on individuals and their physical activities within the U.S.
Right.
But even having that, kind of broader awareness could still provide really crucial context for the FBI's investigations.
Exactly. So while the, immediate operational value might have been different, depending on the agency, this initial phase was really fundamental.
Right.
It established, this system for tracking who was coming in.
Yeah.
And it laid the groundwork for, much more targeted investigations down the line.
Yeah.
And then we get to phase 2.
Okay.
And phase 2 things escalate a little bit.
Right.
And they move into technical surveillance of official establishments.
Okay.
And so now we're talking about the discrete use of surveillance technology, hidden microphones, things like that within the embassies and consulates of selected non-Soviet countries.
All right. So they're really stepping up their game here.
Yeah. And the document suggests that this was, generally focused on nations that were in what they considered trouble areas at the time.
Sure.
Or of, particular interest to the U.S. government.
Yeah.
But it's important to note that this wasn't just like this widespread, indiscriminate effort.
Exactly.
The documents clearly state that this level of surveillance required specific requests and explicit approval from a high-ranking State Department official.
Right. Usually the Deputy Undersecretary of State.
Right.
So, again, they're really being careful here, trying to balance, their intelligence needs with these diplomatic sensitivities.
And the goal here was really two-pronged. They wanted to gather intelligence that was relevant to the FBI's counterintelligence work.
Sure.
But they also wanted to collect information that could help other U.S. agencies with their foreign intelligence needs. And by December 1961, the list of countries under this technical coverage included Cuba, the Dominican Republic, France, Ghana, Israel, the United Arab Republic, and even West Germany.
Wow.
So, you've got a really diverse...
That's a pretty diverse mix.
Yeah. And the fact that, allies like France and West Germany are on there.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
Why do you think they were
it's really interesting.
Monitoring their own partners in this way?
Right. It suggests that, their concerns went beyond just immediate adversaries.
Yeah.
They really wanted to understand kind of the broader geopolitical landscape and, what their allies were thinking, what they were up to.
Right. Maybe they were concerned about, technology transfer, or they wanted to understand their allies' perspectives on key international issues.
Right. Yeah. And these surveillance operations weren't just static.
Right.
They weren't just set it and forget it.
Yeah.
The documents mentioned that there were periodic evaluations, implying that they were constantly assessing, whether these were effective and whether they needed to continue them.
Yeah.
And we even have this memo from July of 1966 that talks about continuing technical surveillance coverage on diplomatic establishments.
Yeah.
This is something that they were clearly committed to.
Yeah.
And here's something that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
There's this budget document labeled 12.pdf.
All right.
That shows, significant funds that were allocated under something called Project Liberty.
Okay.
For, cryptographic equipment and supplies.
Right. Wow.
And just general equipment and supplies in fiscal years 1961 and 1962.
Yeah.
And we're talking, tens of thousands of dollars here.
Yeah.
A lot of money.
That's a significant investment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is potentially directly linked to these technical surveillance activities, targeting something that they label as WP2 Mexico and WP2 Americas.
WP2, huh?
Yeah, and I don't know what WP2 means exactly, but it definitely seems like...
It sounds like some kind of, code or designation.
Yeah. But it does seem to suggest that, we're talking about, specific FBI operational targets likely related to Mexican diplomatic activities, given the Mexico there.
Yeah.
And Project Liberty itself, kind of hints at, why they might be doing this.
Yeah.
Framing it within, national security and intelligence gathering.
Yeah.
And I think that budget information is just so interesting.
Yeah.
Because it gives you that,
It makes it real, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just, some theoretical program. They were putting serious resources into this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, then we come to phase 3.
All right.
And this is where things get really delicate.
Okay.
We're talking about the development of live sources. And this involved the recruitment and cultivation of confidential informants.
Wow.
Within the diplomatic missions of these same...
Okay, so now they're going inside the embassies. Yeah.
And, if technical surveillance was sensitive, this was, the most sensitive phase.
Absolutely.
And it absolutely required proper written approval from the State Department.
Yeah, you can understand why. I mean, the risks associated with, cultivating human sources. I mean, inside these embassies are huge. I mean, if they were discovered, it could lead to, serious diplomatic repercussions, expulsions, damage to relations. So, the State Department approval was absolutely mandatory here.
Yeah. And the criteria for targeting individuals, for potential recruitment was varied. And, the documents mention, things like if the country was perceived as leaning towards the Soviet bloc, even if they weren't fully aligned with them, or if there were, internal crises going on within the target country, whether those were political or economic crises.
Situations where people might be more vulnerable to being approached.
Exactly. Or, just a specific investigative need that couldn't be met through other intelligence methods. And the FBI consistently sought State Department clearance.
Okay.
Not just to initiate these programs in specific countries, but also for... the actual steps of investigating and even interviewing potential sources. And it's interesting that sometimes they wouldn't initially disclose the precise intelligence objectives to the State Department.
That's interesting. So they would get approval for the program, but then they would, kind of withhold some of the specifics until later. Interesting.
And by September of 1964, the documents indicate that the FBI was actively developing sources in something like 44 friendly foreign nations.
Wow.
All with the State Department's approval. And we even have, a specific case study here. 1960 memo details, the FBI's request for, and then the granting of State Department clearance to develop informants within all Ceylonese diplomatic establishments in the U.S. And Ceylonese, that's Sri Lankan. And this approval came with a specific condition. The target had to be a U.S. citizen.
A U.S. citizen?
Yeah.
Why do you think that was?
I don't know. It's interesting, right? It seems like, they were really sensitive to the idea of, directly recruiting foreign nationals within their own diplomatic missions. So maybe targeting a U.S. citizen, even one working in the embassy, was seen as, less of an infringement on Sri Lanka's sovereignty. And so it carried less of a risk of diplomatic fallout.
It's like they were trying to, minimize the potential for blowback.
Exactly. And then interestingly, later memos suggest that they actually moved to a more cautious approach. There's this recommendation for getting oral clearance from the State Department before, really investing a lot of investigative resources into developing sources in a particular field. And they really emphasized, sticking to those trouble spot countries.
So they were constantly refining their approach as they went along.
Exactly. And then, beyond these kind of formal 3-phrase programs, the documents also reveal, significant instances of interagency cooperation and information sharing. the FBI wasn't operating in a vacuum.
Right.
They were getting help from other agencies, particularly the CIA.
Yeah.
And they were proactively sharing,
right.
Leads and suspicions with the Bureau.
And that's so important, right? I mean,
Yeah.
having that interagency collaboration is crucial.
Right.
I mean, different agencies have, different capabilities. They have access to different information. They have different areas of expertise.
Right.
So, when they share information, it helps them to create a much more complete intelligence picture.
Right. And, we see, for example, the CIA suggesting an individual within the embassy of Thailand as a potential source of political information.
Right.
And that's a clear case of, leveraging the CIA's, overseas intelligence network.
Absolutely.
Potential domestic counterintelligence purposes.
Yeah.
And then we have another case where the CIA suspected 2 French diplomats of being intelligence agents.
Right.
And they shared this with the FBI, and that potentially triggered a domestic counterintelligence investigation.
Yeah, and again, it highlights the fact that they weren't just focused on adversaries.
Right.
The CIA might uncover information that was relevant to the FBI's work, even if it involved, people from allied nations.
Right.
So it just shows how interconnected everything was.
Yeah, and this cooperation also extended to avoiding duplication of effort.
Right.
So, for example, when there were suspicions of illegal entries into New York City that might have, an intelligence angle, the FBI checked with the CIA to see if they had any information or ongoing operations.
Yeah, it's all about, efficiency, making sure that they weren't wasting resources, and that they were coordinating their efforts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, looking at all of these documents, a clear picture really emerges.
Yeah.
The U.S. Cold War intelligence apparatus was casting a far wider net than we might imagine. They were extending their gaze to the diplomatic circles of nations that they considered friendly.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, the efforts they took to monitor, to surveil, to cultivate sources within these missions, it really shows how cautious they were.
Right. Yeah. And how much they wanted to gather information, how much they valued intelligence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these documents also paint this fascinating picture
right.
of, the kind of push and pull that was going on between different intelligence agencies.
Right.
And, the necessary and sometimes delicate negotiations with the State Department.
Yeah, they had to be so careful not to step on each other's toes or cause diplomatic problems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, the real takeaway here is that, the Cold War wasn't this simple, us versus them dichotomy.
It was much more complex than that. Yeah.
The U.S. government really recognized that they needed to understand the policies, the intentions, the vulnerabilities of a whole range of countries.
Absolutely.
And, they developed this sophisticated but carefully managed system to do that. And, even when it involved, close allies.
Yeah.
And that constant need for State Department approval
right.
really reminds us that, there were these constraints and diplomatic considerations
Absolutely.
that really shaped, how they could operate.
Yeah.
And, I think it's so interesting to think about, the sheer amount of resources and effort that they dedicated to understanding, even friendly nations during the Cold War.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder, how these priorities and these methods have potentially evolved in the post-Cold War era.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the world has changed so much since the Cold War.
Right.
The nature of global power has shifted.
Right.
You've got the rise of non-state actors.
Right.
You've got cyber espionage.
Right.
Economic espionage.
Right.
All these new challenges.
Right.
So, I think it's safe to say that intelligence priorities have had to adapt.
Yeah.
But, the fundamental need for information.
Right.
I don't think that's going away.
Right. And I think that's what's so fascinating about looking at these historical documents, it gives you a glimpse into how they were thinking back then.
Absolutely.
That makes you wonder, how those methods have changed and how they've stayed the same.
Yeah.
But, as revealing as this deep dive has been, it really only scratches the surface.
Yeah, there's so much more out there.
Right.
I mean, we've just, dipped our toes in the water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, we really encourage you, our listeners,
Yeah.
to go out and explore these historical records for yourselves.
Yeah, you might be surprised by what you find.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because there's so much to uncover about this fascinating and consequential period in history.
It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us today on Study Hall.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.